A drone loaded with explosives blasted a hole in the roof of a prison that has held some of Ecuador's most notorious drug lords in the latest sign of the nation's descent into chaos.
Living conditions here is terrible.
Inside this mega prison, you'll find some of El Salvador's most dangerous gang members packed into massive cells, towers of bunk beds, and what looks like bird cages.
Cartel members don't end up in ordinary prisons. Their heinous crimes land them in some of the most brutal and infamous facilities worldwide. But while prison life is grim for anyone, cartel inmates face a relentless battle for survival, where power, allies, and sheer luck determine who makes it out alive. Here are some prisons for cartel members that are worse than death.
We're going to head to El Salvador, where back in February, the president announced he was moving thousands of high-ranking gang members to the country's new so-called mega jail.
Hundreds of inmates, barefoot and stripped down to white shorts, scurry into El Salvador's new mega prison, ordered to crouch down on the ground one after another.
The government says the most hardened gang members end up here at the Terrorism Confinement Center. Government images from inside have been widely shared on social media.
El Salvador's mega prison, also called the Terrorism Containment Center, is arguably the biggest and most brutal prison in Central America at the moment. With a population of just over 6 million, El Salvador was previously ranked as the world's most dangerous country, seeing over 3,000 homicides annually. This widespread violence stemmed from gang warfare between two formidable criminal organizations, MS-13 and Barrio 18 street gang. To address this crisis, young President Nayib Bukele declared an intense war on gangs, resulting in the arrest and imprisonment of over 75,000 individuals accused of gang affiliation. And to keep them locked away for a really long time, he constructed the world's largest prison. This massive prison complex, isolated in a remote area, has become the defining symbol of President Bukele's security approach. Critics argue it's a black hole of human rights, where standard guidelines for prisoner treatment are ignored. Inside the facility, night never falls, as artificial lights remain on continuously. Air trickles through a lattice ceiling, briefly cutting the intense heat that can reach 35 degrees Celsius during the day, with no other ventilation provided. Dubbed the Alcatraz of Central America, the prison is new and spotless, with guards hooded and armed, patrolling every corner. Prisoners sleep on bare metal in 4-story bunk beds with no mattresses or bedding. Their meals, rice, beans, hard-boiled eggs, or pasta, are eaten by hand. Cells surrounded by 3 cement walls contain only 2 sinks and 2 toilets in plain view. Prisoners leave their cells for only 30 minutes daily, exercising in the central corridor of Block 3, one of the 8 blocks in this complex, which spans the area of 7 football fields, surrounded by 2 electrified fences and 2 concrete walls. It is guarded by 19 towers. Officially, CCOT can accommodate 40,000 inmates, though the exact number held there is undisclosed. Around 60 to 75 inmates share each cell of about 100 square meters. Skylights illuminate the corridors, and the prison includes amenities like dining rooms and exercise spaces, but only for the guards. To take care of discipline, there are dark, windowless punishment cells and rooms for virtual court hearings. Family visits are prohibited. However, Amnesty International has documented widespread human rights violations here, with innocent individuals being detained to meet arrest quotas, leaving families struggling to secure their release. Now, despite such issues, these challenges haven't deterred Bukele from his mission. To showcase El Salvador's newfound security, he hosted the Miss Universe event last November, embracing the title, "The World's Coolest Dictator."
In an exclusive interview, a former warden and a former inmate tell us death is easier than life at the federal supermax.
Supermax is the place that America sends the prisoners it wants to punish the most, a place former warden Robert Hood describes as a clean version of hell.
America's most secure supermax facility, ADX Florence, houses some of the federal prison system's most dangerous inmates, including El Chapo, the infamous drug lord. Confined in 7 by 12-foot concrete cells, they spend 23 hours each day locked away. The prison takes its name from Florence, the nearby town in Fremont County, Colorado, and is one of several correctional facilities in the area, with Colorado State Prison located in Cannon City. Communication with guards is restricted to small slots in the cell doors, and meaningful human interaction is nearly absent. The extreme isolation and lack of sensory input have a significant impact on the inmates' mental health. Now, these cells have small windows that deny prisoners any true sense of the outside world, amplifying their sense of disconnection. Inmates are allowed only an hour outside each day, confined to a small, enclosed exercise cage. With no external stimulation, inmates often suffer from severe psychological issues such as anxiety, hallucinations, and even suicidal thoughts. ADX Florence has been described as a clean version of hell by former inmates and staff. Although the facility is meticulously maintained, the sterile walls encase an environment designed to break the human spirit. The combination of solitude and the cramped, oppressive conditions creates intense mental strain, leaving prisoners feeling entirely detached from reality. Suicides are a tragic reality at ADX Florence, with some inmates seeing death as the only escape from their psychological torment. The absence of meaningful engagements with the outside world drives many to a state of hopelessness. Even those who endure their confinement often emerge mentally broken, struggling to reintegrate into society. While ADX Florence may not show the physical brutality seen in other prisons, the invisible psychological torment of its inmates renders it among the most inhumane facilities worldwide.
La Modelo de Bogotá lleva décadas protagonizando todos los horrores de la violencia tras las rejas. Asesinatos al por mayor y al detal, torturas execrables, secuestros infames y un largo etcétera de crímenes no resueltos.
All Colombia knows that this prison is controlled by the mafiosi of the country, that is, the drug traffickers, the paramilitary, and the guerrilla.
In 2020, La Modelo prison in Bogotá, Colombia, lost more inmates to gun violence than it did to the coronavirus. Inmates were devastated at the filthy conditions prison officials left the facility in and decided to protest aid from the government. However, Colombian armed forces attacked those prisoners, killing multiple and leaving a lot more seriously injured. This came as a shock to the international human rights community, but to inmates it was more or less a daily routine. You see, since its opening in 1960, La Modelo has been notorious across Colombia for its brutal violence and extreme overcrowding. Built for 5,000 inmates, it now holds more than double that, with over 11,000 prisoners crammed inside its walls. The left wing of this facility houses rebels and cartel members, while the right wing is packed with government supporters and paramilitary forces. Inmates are forced to sleep in shifts because of a lack of space. There are 5 units here, and not so surprisingly, inmates outnumber guards almost 13-1. In some units packed with very dangerous gangs, guards have to seek permission from inmates who dominate the block before they can be allowed in. In 1999, over 120 inmates escaped this facility through the sewers, and 70 would die through deadly gang confrontations. Now fast forward 2 decades later, and this story has only gotten worse. In that time period, these inmates have made multiple tunnels not only for escape, but to serve as a mass grave for those dead inmates. They reportedly used hydrochloric acid, which no one knows how they got access to, and would get cooking gas to dissolve the bodies in small ashy pots till they disintegrated completely. Sometimes inmates would take the flesh of these cadavers to produce meat products like hamburgers and sausages. Dear God. But what's even more horrifying is that the fact these inmates and prison guards aren't the only ones at risk here. Even visitors sometimes get kidnapped and even murdered once they enter this facility. One example is Colombian journalist Jeanette Bedoya. In May 2000, Ms. Bedoya had planned to meet with an inmate, Mario Jaimes, aka Panadero, or the Baker, who was a leader of the paramilitary wing inside the prison. He'd agreed to do an interview with her to potentially expose the corruption inside the facility. However, while awaiting clearance to go inside, Ms. Bedoya was kidnapped on his orders and taken to a faraway location where she was tortured and raped for over 6 hours. Subsequently, she was tied up and dumped by the side of the road, where she was spotted by onlookers. Her story, along with that of many other cases of violence and disappearances, led the Colombian government to switch out the prison director at La Modelo. However, sometime in 2024, this new director was shot dead after receiving multiple death threats for trying to change how the facility was being run. Make no mistake, there are more guns and ammunition in this prison than there are security guards, and any Colombian cartel member sent here typically has two choices: accept their doomed fate or use every drop of blood to survive. Mendoza Prison in Argentina is a fortress of despair where survival itself feels like a gamble. Built to hold only 600 people, this place now houses over 1,600 inmates, cramming as many as 5 prisoners at a time in tiny 4 square meter cells, forcing them to sleep on the floor without mattresses. The lack of basic amenities forced these people to defecate in plastic bags and urinate in bottles due to the limited septic system. Now, the shortage of hygiene facilities result in filthy, garbage-strewn corridors that are often flooded with sewage. As disturbing as that is, when it comes to medical care, things get a lot worse. This prison facility lacks a concrete database that can record the medical history of its inmates, and assistance is typically called on only after an inmate's death. Violence and abuse are pretty frequent, but it's primarily due to the undertrained guards at this place. These guards unnecessarily use brutal force on inmates, sometimes wearing hoods to mask their identities. And when they're not beating down inmates, the guards occasionally facilitate the trafficking of drugs, especially amongst convicted drug traffickers or cartel members. I mean, I could go on endlessly about the dismal living conditions at this facility, but these issues are just a reflection of the larger problems facing Argentina itself. Oh, and best believe the conditions at Mendoza haven't gone unnoticed by the Argentine government, yet they haven't necessarily done anything to combat the growing problems. Despite their promises to build new facilities and ease overcrowding, few improvements have been seen, and to protest these inhumane conditions, several young inmates at Mendoza even sewed their mouths shut, demanding an end to the mistreatment and neglect they face behind those bars. Now, of course, you can argue that Mendoza prison is where the toughest and most notorious criminals in Argentina are locked up, so they technically don't deserve a bed of roses or a golden bathtub. However, while this prison incarcerates the worst of the worst, some Argentines are held up in this place before going to trial, and its brutal conditions highlight some serious cracks in Argentina's prison system. With little oversight and minimal resources, the facility has become infamous, showing just how bad things can get when prisoners are stripped of basic rights and any real chance at a future.
One of the world's most dangerous drug traffickers on the loose, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, escaped Saturday from Mexico's highest security prison.
These are the last images of Guzman before he makes the most daring escape in recent history.
For El Chapo, Altiplano prison was like a 5-star hotel getaway. But for any regular cartel member, it would have been a 5-star ticket straight to hell. Life inside Altiplano prison is anything but easy. For most inmates, it's a tough place, filled with danger lurking at every corner. Reports show the violence is a daily reality, with inmates often having to watch their backs and form alliances just to survive. But to put into context just how dangerous this place is, masked men invaded while inmates slept on March 12, 2020. Now, these guys stormed the prisoners' cells, dragged them out, ransacked their belongings, and delivered their brutal kicks to ribs and groins. Some inmates suffered broken fingers, while others were subjected to electrical shocks to their anuses. Damn. The following day, during their usual Friday phone call with relatives, inmates were instructed not to mention what had happened the previous night, since authorities monitored their conversations. However, during family visits on March 14th, relatives noticed that the prisoners were barely able to move and had visible bruises on their faces and bodies. So from that night onward, the inmates faced continuous torture until they were transferred out of this facility. Now, apart from the beatdowns, overcrowded conditions and lack of medical care made things even worse, creating an atmosphere where fear and desperation are the norms. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. El Chapo, the infamous drug lord, had a very different experience here at Altiplano. Now, for him, it was like a luxury stay, at least until his record-breaking escape. While most inmates were struggling just to make it through the day, he was managing to pull off a daring escape through a tunnel that stretched a mile long. Now talk about a plot twist. This whole situation really highlights a wild paradox. On one hand, you have everyday cartel members facing brutal conditions, and on the other, you have El Chapo, who seem to turn the prison into a personal playground. And despite the fact that Altiplano is temporarily shut down, it's just a reminder of how the system can sometimes bend for those at the top, while the rest are left to fight for their lives.
We're in trouble. There's no help out there, really.
Everything's dirty. Just sitting on the toilet is horrendous.
I've been here from the conditions, or the medical conditions here. There's been 9 people on this tier who have just died.
La Mesa prison in Tijuana, Mexico is a pit of nightmares, where each corner steeps into untold horrors. Just imagine a prison where inmates weren't confined to cells but moved about freely, did their own thing, and lived by their own code. That was La Mesa not so long ago. Drug lords held the power, transforming the prison into their own domain, complete with shops, eateries, and even nightclubs. Violence was also part of this landscape, with corruption widespread. However, this era of disorder ended in 2002 when the Mexican government intervened, razing the old La Mesa and reconstructing it from the ground up. Today, the prison is tightly governed under the strict supervision of Director Cesar Daniel Ramirez Acevedo, whose mission is to prevent any return to the lawlessness of the past. Life at La Mesa today is vastly different. Over 3,000 inmates, from minor offenders to hardened cartel sicarios, now reside in an environment under rigid control. Inmates spend the majority of their days in crowded cells, often sharing tight quarters with several cellmates. They're rarely allowed out of their cells, and the only glimpse of sunlight they get is through the prison's bars. When it comes to the daily routine, it also gets strict and repetitive. Inmates are allowed out only for limited hours each week, mainly for brief yard time and supervised visits with family. But even then, interactions are carefully regulated to suppress any gang activity and violence. Inmates sent to this perfect replica of hell typically commit offenses ranging from theft to murder, with an average sentence lasting 5 years. But regardless of how strict this place is, it hasn't gone down without its shortcomings. September 13th, 2008, 3 inmates lost their lives in a riot ignited by anger over a fellow inmate's death during a search for contraband. Another riot broke out just 5 days later, claiming 19 lives and leaving 12 injured. Now, this second riot was fueled by frustration over a lack of water. Since the first riot, these 2 riots made headlines, but they were just like the tip of the iceberg. Imagine how many other lives might have quietly slipped away within those prison walls, piling up stories the world may never hear.
The Coleman Federal Prison in Sumter County houses inmates convicted of everything from murder to check fraud.
OSHA has put Coleman Federal Prison on notice after determining a string of violence against correction officers made that facility a hazardous workplace.
Larry Nassar, the disgraced former doctor convicted of sexually abusing young American Olympians, is in the hospital tonight after being attacked.
Once celebrated as the cabbage capital of the world, a small Floridian town is now better known for housing some of the country's most notorious criminals. Located around 10 minutes southeast of Coleman in Sumter County, USP Coleman II is a high-security U.S. penitentiary that holds over 1,214 male inmates, including former Olympic doctor Larry Nassar, who faced hundreds of abuse accusations, and Edgar Valdez Villarreal, aka La Barbie, one of the most brutal cartel sicarios to ever walk the earth. Built in 2004 as an expansion, USP Coleman II is part of a larger Coleman Federal Correctional Complex, which also includes FCI Coleman Low, which is a low-security federal correctional institute, and FCI Coleman Medium, which is medium security. While it might sound like just another facility, USP Coleman II has now gained a reputation for being a dangerous place, and for good reason. This high-security prison houses some of the most notorious criminals, creating a tense atmosphere that can lead to violence. Inmates have reportedly lost their lives during altercations within this facility, and adding to this prison's notoriety, Larry Nassar, the former Olympic doctor, was also stabbed while incarcerated there. I mean, Nasser's presence in a place like USP Coleman 2 certainly draws attention, not just for his infamous past, but also because it puts him in the same space as other high-profile criminals. Now, Nasser was convicted of sexually assaulting at least 265 women and girls under the guise of medical treatment while he worked as the team doctor for the U.S. women's national gymnastics team. So, of course, other inmates weren't going to let Nasser have a swell time without getting a more brutal form of justice for his crime. However, with its blend of high-profile inmates and volatile atmosphere, it's clear that no one, no matter how infamous, like Labadabi from the Beltran Leyva cartel, escapes the violence and horrors that haunt this facility. Life at Chiconatla Prison in Ecatepec, Mexico isn't just tough, it's downright haunting. With massive overcrowding, inmates are squeezed into cells way past capacity, turning the place into a powder keg of tension and violence. It's pretty unsettling, but the real shock lies in the everyday brutality that plays out here. In February 2023, a chilling scene unfolded right outside their walls. Guards found blood smeared on the prison gates and, nearby, two headless bodies, a man and a woman, left as gruesome markers. The heads, found in an orange bag nearby, looked like someone tried to throw them over the prison fence. And next to the bodies lay a green cardboard sign with a message in bold black letters, pointing to gang activity, likely aimed at sending a fearsome message. But what's more is that there was blood on the bars of some cells, suggesting the killers might have actually been inmates. Inside Chiconatla, stories like this are barely shocking anymore. They're just part of this grim reality for the guards and inmates here. But it doesn't stop with external threats. Violence amongst inmates are just as lethal. In 2024, a fight breaks out in Module 3, involving 3 inmates, each with their own criminal backgrounds. Rosalio, sentenced to 20 years for violent car theft. Ramon, facing 9 years for robbery. And Manuel, awaiting trial for illegal detention, ended up in a deadly confrontation. Manuel was fatally wounded, while the other 2 landed in the hospital. Now, these kinds of clashes are all too common, showing how far order has slipped in this prison. Now, officials from the State of Mexico Security Secretariat are investigating and reviewing the roles of inmates and possibly negligent guards in these unprecedented levels of violence. There's also an internal review by the Undersecretariat of Penitentiary Control, aiming to figure out if some of the bloodshed could have been prevented with better oversight. But at the end of the day, conditions at Chiconatla scream for reform, as overcrowding, weak security, and gang control have turned this place into a breeding ground for violence, and not rehabilitation. With little being done to improve resources or tackle the problems, this vicious cycle of brutality seems all but set to continue, leaving both guards and inmates in constant danger.
The Ecuadorian police defused an explosive-laden drone on the roof of a prison on the 12th of September. Now, the drone, believe it or not, landed on the roof of the Roca Maximum Security Prison in Guayaquil.
September 2024. Composed of police and military personnel combating drug trafficking in Ecuador, spotted a drone flying over the La Roca Maximum Security Prison. Now, this drone was launched to breach the security and free over 100 inmates. How was that going to play out? I don't know. But what we do know is that this incident was one of many to occur at La Roca Prison, Ecuador's 5-star hell for cartel members and drug traffickers. La Roca Prison, built in 2006, proudly claims to be maximum security, yet its defenses are so flimsy it's more like maximum insecurity in disguise. Just 3 months after the Ministry of Justice took control here, an attempted escape occurred, and an explosion would destroy the prison's perimeter wall, creating a hole for inmates to escape. Sadly, 5 individuals died in the process, including security guards. Now, there's also been a discovery of an underground communication network with 7 bases and transmission antennas that was constructed near the Men's Rehabilitation Center to aid inmates for communicating with the outside world. But apart from being literally the worst maximum security prison in the world, La Roca also sees its fair share of violence amongst inmates. Security guards versus inmates, or drones versus security guards. June 25, 2011, a prisoner, William P., was shot dead by another inmate who possessed a revolver within his cell. The following year, another inmate, Jose Luis, was also fatally shot 10 times in his cell while 2 guards would watch. That same year, a brawl breaks out between rival gangs, leading to an explosion that injures 3 detainees. And it's crazy when you think about it because Ecuador was never known for violence. But I guess being bordered by major cocaine-producing countries like Colombia and Peru, it somehow turned a peaceful nation into a key hub for drug trafficking. Ecuadorian prisons are now overrun by gangs linked to Colombian and Mexican cartels, resulting in deadly clashes that have claimed the lives of over 430 inmates. In 2022, Ecuador's murder rate soared to a record 26 per 100,000 people, doubling from the previous year and even surpassing the rates in Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil. Recently, a drone carrying 40 pounds of explosives was spotted hovering over the prison. Authorities managed to shoot it down, but this wasn't the first drone attack at La Roca. Back in 2013, another drone detonated above the facility, causing serious roof damage and triggering an escape by drug lord alias Fido. That incident was so intense the government had to declare a state of emergency until he was eventually recaptured, though he's since managed to escape again. But maybe here's the real issue. La Roca has effectively become a criminal stronghold. With a glaring lack of state control, many inmates are left at the mercy of powerful gangs that even wield political influence. For cartel members inside, it's simple. Either join forces with them or get out of the way. And honestly, going up against them, that's not really an option.
A United States Penitentiary Terre Haute inmate is dead after being found unresponsive early this morning.
Officials report another inmate at the federal prison in Terre Haute died on Thursday. It is the 3rd death at that facility this month.
2 things naturally occur when you're brought into Terre Haute. 1, you face the constant threat of violent confrontations that can break out at any moment. And 2, you live with a looming reality of solitary confinement, where isolation can stretch from weeks to months, slowly breaking even the toughest of spirits. Terre Haute is a high-security prison complex that includes a max-security penitentiary, a medium-security federal correctional institute, and a low-security camp. Now, the max-security section is notable for housing federal death row inmates and has become the only federal prison in the U.S. where executions are carried out. Kevin Beaver, a former guard, described the death row unit in this facility as a very choreographed area, with cells containing basic amenities like a bed, desk, shower, and a toilet. The area, officially named the confinement unit, is so quiet you'd think you were in a library. Now, some notable inmates here are Dylan Roof, convicted in the Charleston church shooting that claimed 9 lives, and infamous Mexican cartel leader Ociel Cárdenas Guillén. Cárdenas was the former leader of the Gulf Cartel and heavily influenced the drug trade in Mexico, especially around Matamoros. He was extradited to the U.S. in 2007, facing charges of drug trafficking, assault, and threatening U.S. federal agents. Cárdenas was sentenced to 25 years in 2010, and recent reports indicate he's serving his term at Terre Haute. From the outside, the prison complex might look calm and serene, but once you dig deeper, you'll find a very different story unfolding. In 2008, the American Civil Liberties Union criticized the living conditions at Terre Haute, describing them as grossly inadequate, with limited medical care and minimal mental health services. Sister Rita Claire Girardeau, a spiritual advisor for death row inmates, once shared her perspective on their living conditions, saying inmates are in small, isolated cells, receiving meals through a slot, and allowed only 3 times out a week into small outdoor cages. They communicate with each other from the front of their cells and have restricted phone, email, and library access. Now, the facility also includes the Communication Management Unit, or CMU, which opened in 2006 for inmates with terrorism-related convictions. The CMU houses 50 cells, primarily for those convicted in high-profile post-9/11 terrorism cases. Inmates like John Walker Lind, the American Taliban, and Somali pirate Abduwali Abdukad Muse, dramatized in Captain Phillips, are kept in this unit. Communication is heavily restricted, with only 2 2-hour non-physical visits per month and 1 15-minute phone call weekly. All correspondence are monitored and screened, and English is the only permitted language. There is also a faith-based unit for 125 inmates who engage in faith-related activities when not working. Inmates here are allowed 7 visitation days monthly, and 300 minutes of phone time in 15-minute increments. Many work for Unicor, producing military accessories and earning around $6.50 to $7.50 daily, with some piece rate workers making up to $12. So depending on the crime and the behavior of the criminal, Terre Haute treats its inmates differently. But one thing is, rest assured, it's not going to be an easy ride.